The Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski in September 1939 was one of the largest and most complex armored clashes of the September campaign, yet it has often remained overshadowed by the defense of Warsaw, the Bzura counteroffensive, and the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland. To understand its place in the chronology of the Polish campaign, one must first examine the geopolitical and military context that shaped the confrontation. By mid-September 1939, the military situation for Poland was deteriorating rapidly. Germany's invasion, launched on September 1st, with approximately 1.5 million troops organized into 5 army groups, had achieved major successes through the use of combined arms operations, armored divisions spearheaded by motorized infantry, supported by the Luftwaffe. The Polish army, numbering around 1 million men mobilized in over 30 divisions, resisted fiercely but faced major disadvantages in armor, mechanization, and air support. Despite isolated successes, such as delaying actions along the Vistula and the counteroffensive at the Bzura, Polish forces were steadily pushed eastward. The Tomaszów Lubelski region, located in southeastern Poland near the Lublin-Lwów corridor, became a focal point for Polish forces seeking to regroup. Several armies that had withdrawn from central Poland converged here, including remnants of the Krakow Army, the Lublin Army, and parts of the Prusy Army. By mid-September, these formations were reorganized into the Northern Front under General Stefan Dąb-Biernacki and the Southern Front under General Juliusz Rommel's former subordinates. Their combined strength exceeded 150,000 troops with around 300 tanks and armored vehicles, though many units were depleted, undersupplied, and operating with improvised command structures. The strategic importance of the Tomaszów Lubelski region stemmed from its position on the route to Lwów, a major city in southeastern Poland where Polish forces hoped to establish a defensive stronghold. Lwów, with its fortifications, stockpiles, and strategic rail links, was viewed as a potential last bastion from which the Polish army could continue resistance and maintain contact with Romania. The Romanian bridgehead strategy envisaged a defensive perimeter in southeastern Poland, where Polish forces could hold out until Allied offensives materialized in the west. German command recognized this intention and acted to block it. The 14th Army, under General Wilhelm List, directed several mechanized and infantry divisions to cut Polish forces off from Lwów and prevent their consolidation. The German 4th Light Division and 2nd Panzer Division, reinforced by infantry divisions, moved to intercept the Polish retreat. Their combined strength in armor, over 350 tanks, gave them superiority in mechanized warfare, though the Poles possessed armored battalions equipped with 7 TP tanks, Vickers, E-tanks, and tankettes that were still capable of engaging German panzers effectively in localized encounters. Politically, the battle occurred against the backdrop of Soviet intervention. On 17 September, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland with over 450,000 troops, in accordance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This move sealed Poland's fate, dividing its territory between two powers. For the Polish High Command, the Soviet invasion eliminated the possibility of retreating to the Romanian bridgehead in an organized fashion. Nevertheless, many field commanders were not immediately aware of the full scale of the Soviet advance, and their immediate focus remained on breaking through German lines near Tomaszów to reach Lwów. Public sentiment by this stage of the campaign reflected exhaustion and uncertainty. Civilians in southeastern Poland had already witnessed the passage of retreating Polish troops, the destruction caused by Luftwaffe bombings, and the influx of refugees from central Poland. For many, the approaching battle meant further devastation, requisitions, and the risk of being caught between advancing armies. At the same time, hope persisted that the concentration of Polish forces in the region might stabilize the situation, or at least provide an orderly path of retreat toward Romania. Thus, the preconditions for the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski were set by converging military and political dynamics. The German drive to complete the encirclement of remaining Polish forces, the Polish determination to break through toward Lwów, and the Soviet advance from the east that made such a breakthrough increasingly urgent. These intersecting pressures ensured that the clash would be fought on a large scale, involving tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of armored vehicles, in what would become one of the most significant but least remembered confrontations of the September campaign. The opening phase of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski began on September 17, 1939, at the very moment when the strategic situation for Poland changed irreversibly with the entry of Soviet forces across its eastern frontier. For commanders in the field, however, the immediate concern was the German encirclement in southeastern Poland. The convergence of multiple Polish formations in the Lublin region set the stage for a clash that would involve large numbers of troops and one the heaviest concentrations of armor seen in the September campaign. General Stefan Dąb-Biernacki, commanding the northern front, brought with him remnants of several armies retreating from the center of the country. His formations included battered but still sizable infantry divisions, elements of the cavalry, and a few armored battalions equipped with 7 TP light tanks, Vickers tanks, and tankettes. South of him, forces under General Tadeusz Piskor, drawn from the Krakow and Lublin armies, also converged on the area. The combined Polish strength in the region numbered around 150,000 men with roughly 300 armored fighting vehicles, though these were scattered across improvised units and often short of fuel and ammunition. On the German side, the 14th Army under General Wilhelm List prepared to block the Polish escape routes to Lwów and further south toward Romania. The spearhead of this effort was formed by the 4th Light Division and the 2nd Panzer Division, supported by several infantry divisions advancing from the west and north. Together, they could field approximately 350 tanks, mostly Panzer I and II models, supplemented by Panzer IIIs and IVs in smaller numbers. German mechanization and logistics allowed these divisions to concentrate quickly on the Tomaszów sector, establishing strong blocking positions to prevent any Polish breakout. The opening contacts occurred along the approaches to Tomaszów Lubelski, where German reconnaissance units ran into Polish cavalry patrols and armored detachments. On 17 September, near Krasnobród and Tesowce, Polish cavalry brigades clashed with German mechanized elements in fast-moving skirmishes. Though limited in scale, these encounters signaled to both sides that major forces were in proximity and that control of the area would not be secured without full-scale battle. Civilians in the towns and villages of the region observed columns of troops and armored vehicles moving through fields and narrow roads, realizing that their communities lay directly in the path of the coming confrontation. German command decisions in the opening phase emphasized speed and encirclement. Their objective was to close the corridor toward Lwów and cut off the Polish armies before they could consolidate. Orders to the 2nd Panzer Division directed it to seize road junctions leading southeast, while the 4th Light Division was tasked with holding the northern approaches. Polish commanders, meanwhile, resolved to push southward as rapidly as possible, using their remaining armor to break through German lines. The Polish doctrine at this stage prioritized concentrated thrusts of tanks and infantry, coordinated by artillery, in an attempt to overwhelm local German defenses before larger mechanized forces could regroup. The atmosphere of uncertainty marked this opening phase. News of the Soviet invasion had reached some Polish officers, but not all, and its full implications were not yet understood. To many commanders, the most immediate threat remained the German divisions in front of them. Soldiers were aware of the dire situation, but still motivated by the possibility of reaching Lwów or the Romanian frontier, where they believed organized resistance could continue. For German troops, the mission was more straightforward: eliminate the last concentrations of the Polish army and complete the campaign. By the end of the 18th of September, both sides had committed forward elements to probing attacks around Tomaszów, Lubelski, Krasnobród, and Tyszówce. The Germans sought to channel Polish movements into narrow corridors where their mechanized divisions could apply pressure. The Poles, determined to preserve maneuver space, launched attacks with infantry and armor that surprised German units with their intensity. The stage was thus set for larger engagements, as both sides prepared to commit their main forces in what would become the decisive armored clashes of the battle. The strategic goals and planning that shaped the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski reflected the increasingly desperate position of the Polish army and the methodical determination of German forces to complete their encirclement. For Poland, the overriding objective was to break through the German ring and reach Lwów, a major urban and defensive center where remnants of the army could reorganize. For Germany, the task was to close this corridor decisively, preventing the concentration of Polish forces in southeastern Poland and securing total control of the battlefield. The confrontation became not simply a tactical encounter, but a test of planning, logistics, and adaptability under rapidly shifting circumstances. Polish planning was driven by the remnants of two major formations: General Stefan Dąb-Biernaki's Northern Front and General Tadeusz Piskor's Southern Front. Their combined forces exceeded 150,000 troops, with several divisions still capable of coordinated action. Among them were infantry drawn from the Krakow and Lublin armies, cavalry brigades, and mechanized detachments, including the 10th Motorized Cavalry Brigade and battalions equipped with 7 TP tanks. These armored units were some of the most modern Poland possessed, equipped with 37mm Bofors anti-tank guns that were effective even against German Panzer IIIs and IVs at close range. Yet numbers were limited, and many vehicles had suffered from breakdowns or fuel shortages during the long retreat. The immediate Polish goal was to execute a southward thrust through German blocking positions to reach Lwów. If this failed, commanders hoped at least to push toward the Romanian frontier and establish the so-called Romanian bridgehead. The strategy required concentration of armor and infantry in coordinated assaults, supported by artillery. However, supply shortages imposed serious constraints. Ammunition for artillery and tanks was running low, and fuel was scarce. Commanders calculated that only a limited number of armored thrusts could be mounted before resources were exhausted. This placed immense pressure on achieving quick breakthroughs rather than prolonged engagements. German planning, by contrast, aimed at methodical encirclement. General Wilhelm Leist's 14th Army directed the 4th Light Division and the 2nd Panzer Division to block the approaches to Tomaszów Lubelski, while infantry divisions advanced to close escape routes and hold ground captured by mechanized units. The German operational doctrine emphasized speed, combined arms coordination, and the use of armor not only to attack, but to create psychological shock. Reconnaissance aircraft and local Luftwaffe detachments provided intelligence on Polish movements, enabling German commanders to anticipate thrusts and reinforce threatened sectors. Propaganda and perception also played roles in planning. German high command wanted to present the elimination of the remaining Polish armies as proof that the campaign had been concluded with total success. Reports to Berlin stressed the urgency of preventing any Polish concentration in the southeast, which could undermine the image of a swift and decisive victory. For the Poles, morale and symbolism mattered as well. Officers explained to their troops that breaking through to Lwów would demonstrate that Poland still retained organized forces, even if the capital had fallen. Thus, both sides attached political significance to the coming battle, in addition to its military objectives. Miscalculations were evident on both sides. Polish commanders underestimated the strength and readiness of German armored divisions positioned near Tomaszów. They hoped that German units were dispersed and weakened by weeks of campaigning, leaving gaps through which concentrated thrusts might succeed. In reality, the 2nd Panzer Division and 4th Light Division were intact, well supplied, and reinforced by infantry. German intelligence, meanwhile, initially underestimated the scale of Polish forces converging in the region. Reports described scattered remnants rather than large, cohesive formations, numbering over 100,000 men. This misjudgment meant that German forces encountered unexpectedly strong and coordinated attacks in the early days of the battle. Logistics shaped the implementation of both plans. German divisions benefited from intact supply lines through occupied Poland, ensuring steady fuel, ammunition, and food deliveries. Polish formations, by contrast, had to live off requisitions from the countryside, creating tension with local civilians and limiting operational flexibility. Horses remained critical to Polish logistics, hauling artillery and supplies over terrain unsuitable for vehicles. Fuel convoys were carefully guarded, as the loss of even a few trucks could cripple armored thrusts. By the 18th of September, Polish plans for a breakout were finalized. Dąb-Biernacki and Piskor agreed to launch concentrated assaults against German blocking forces, using remaining tanks and artillery to open corridors toward Lwów. German commanders, fully aware of the Polish intent through reconnaissance, prepared defensive belts supported by mobile reserves of armor. The confrontation thus entered a stage where both sides expected decisive results within days, with the Poles fighting to preserve the possibility of organized resistance, and the Germans determined to deliver the final blow of the campaign. The first major engagements of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski erupted on the 18th and 19th of September 1939, as Polish forces attempted to break through German positions to reach Lwów. These clashes marked the beginning of a sustained armored confrontation, combining infantry assaults, tank battles, and artillery duels across the wooded and rolling terrain of southeastern Poland. For both sides, these initial encounters set the tone of the campaign. The Poles were determined to fight their way south, while the Germans were equally committed to sealing off the escape corridor and preventing the concentration of enemy forces in the Lwów region. On the 18th of September, General Stefan Dąb-Biernaki's Northern Front launched one of the first major Polish assaults. Infantry divisions, supported by armored battalions equipped with 7 TP tanks and Vickers models, advanced toward German lines near Tomaszów Lubelski. Polish artillery opened fire to cover the infantry movement, while tanks pushed along the main road to break through blocking positions. The initial push achieved partial success. Polish armor overran German outposts and inflicted losses on forward infantry elements. In several instances, German Panzer I and II tanks, lightly armored and armed with machine guns or 20mm cannons, were outmatched by the Polish 7 TP tanks, whose 37mm guns penetrated German armor at medium range. However, German command responded quickly. Elements of the 2nd Panzer Division maneuvered to counter the Polish thrust, bringing heavier Panzer IIIs and IVs into the fight. While these models were still relatively few in number, their presence gave the Germans a qualitative edge in firepower and armor protection. Air reconnaissance also provided the German divisions with intelligence on the direction of Polish advances, allowing them to concentrate reserves at decisive points. By the end of the day, Polish units had made gains in local sectors, but failed to open a sustained corridor southward. The following day, 19th September, the fighting intensified around Tomaszów Lubelski itself. German divisions, aware of Polish determination to break through, committed both mechanized and infantry formations in coordinated defense. The town and surrounding villages became contested ground, with artillery fire pounding positions and civilian structures caught in the crossfire. Polish units attempted multiple assaults, sometimes regaining ground briefly, but were met with counterattacks supported by German armor. One notable clash occurred near the village of Komarów, where Polish 7 TP tanks destroyed several German panzers before being forced to withdraw due to lack of ammunition and mounting losses. For civilians in the region, the first engagements were catastrophic. Towns like Tomaszów Lubelski, Krasnobrod, and Tyszówce were filled with refugees from central Poland, swelling the population and straining resources. As battle erupted, artillery shells and airstrikes caused widespread destruction. Many inhabitants fled into the countryside, while others hid in basements or barns as fighting passed through their streets. Livestock was seized by both armies. Barns and homes were used for makeshift defenses, and fields were churned by tanks and artillery fire. For local populations, the arrival of the battle brought immediate devastation to their livelihoods and communities. Polish morale during these first engagements remained surprisingly strong. Soldiers were aware of the broader collapse of the front, but found motivation in the chance to fight a concentrated battle with meaningful objectives. Officers encouraged their men by pointing to the successes of armored units, emphasizing that German losses proved their army was not invincible. At the same time, shortages of fuel and ammunition quickly became apparent. Tank crews rationed shells. Artillery commanders ordered fire only on large concentrations of enemy troops, and infantry units scavenged equipment from the battlefield. German morale reflected a different reality. Soldiers had expected a rapid mop-up operation against disorganized remnants. Instead, they faced coordinated Polish attacks with significant armored support. Reports from the 2nd Panzer Division acknowledged the unexpectedly high resistance and the destruction of German vehicles in tank-to-tank combat. While German superiority in numbers and supply lines reassured commanders, the initial battles demonstrated that defeating the Polish concentration would require more effort than anticipated. The battles of the 18th to 19th of September also revealed the challenges of terrain. Southeastern Poland's roads were narrow and often muddy, limiting the maneuverability of mechanized units. Forests and villages created natural choke points where Polish defenders could ambush advancing columns. Cavalry brigades exploited this terrain, conducting raids on German flanks and retreating before counterattacks could materialize. Although cavalry could not hold ground against mechanized forces, their mobility and local knowledge allowed them to disrupt German movements and buy time for infantry regrouping. By the evening of the 19th of September, both sides had suffered losses but remained committed to continued fighting. Polish units had demonstrated that they could inflict damage on German mechanized forces, but their inability to achieve a decisive breakthrough placed them in a precarious position. German commanders, while acknowledging the difficulties, prepared to tighten the encirclement with additional infantry divisions arriving to reinforce the panzer spearheads. These first engagements thus established the dynamic of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski. The Poles relied on determined assaults, exploiting their remaining tanks and artillery to punch through German defenses. The Germans countered with superior mobility, coordination, and reinforcements, using air reconnaissance and concentrated armor to blunt Polish advances. For civilians, the opening battles brought devastation to their towns and villages, leaving behind ruins, casualties, and streams of refugees. For both armies, it was clear that the battle would not be resolved quickly. Instead, it was unfolding into one of the largest and most complex confrontations of the September campaign, fought under conditions of mounting desperation and unrelenting pressure. The escalation of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski unfolded between the 20th and the 23rd of September 1939, as the fighting spread across multiple axes and reached levels of intensity that rivaled the earlier Bzura counteroffensive in scale. What distinguished this confrontation was not only its size, but also its concentration of armored forces on both sides, making it the largest tank engagement of the September campaign. The crisis phase was defined by the failure of early Polish thrusts, the commitment of additional German divisions, and the worsening conditions for both soldiers and civilians trapped in the combat zone. On 20th September, General Stefan Dąb-Biernacki ordered renewed assaults by the Northern Front against German blocking positions. His aim was to exploit any weakness and push through to Lwów before German reinforcements could fully close the encirclement. Polish forces deployed their remaining armored units aggressively, with 7 TP light tanks leading infantry-supported thrusts toward Tomaszów Lubelski. Cavalry brigades attempted flanking maneuvers to disrupt German supply lines. In several local clashes, Polish tanks destroyed German Panzer IS-2s, which were vulnerable to the 37mm guns of the 7 TP. However, German artillery and air power responded with precision. Luftwaffe sorties bombed Polish columns, disrupting coordination and destroying vehicles along narrow forest roads. By the end of the day, Polish attacks had been repelled, leaving behind burned-out tanks and exhausted infantry. Simultaneously, the Southern Front under General Tadeusz Piskor engaged German units further west, attempting to carve a corridor toward Zamość. These efforts also ran into stiff resistance. German infantry divisions, reinforced by mechanized elements, held key junctions and used their mobility to counterattack Polish advances. Despite moments of localized success, Polish assaults stalled due to lack of fuel and ammunition. Some armored units were forced to abandon vehicles after exhausting their supplies, reducing the effectiveness of further attacks. The crisis deepened on September 21st, when German command committed additional reinforcements. Infantry divisions arriving from the west extended the encirclement, sealing off escape routes and relieving the overstretched panzer units. The 2nd Panzer Division, though taking losses, maintained control of vital crossroads and coordinated with the 4th Light Division to press Polish forces back into narrower sectors. For German commanders, the escalation represented both an opportunity and a necessity. eliminating over 100,000 Polish troops in one concentrated battle would decisively end organized resistance in southeastern Poland. For the Poles, the continued escalation exposed the growing mismatch between ambition and resources. Artillery shells were rationed to the point where batteries could fire only in response to concentrated German attacks. Tank units, once a spearhead of assaults, dwindled as machines were destroyed, immobilized by mechanical failure, or abandoned for lack of fuel. Infantry morale suffered, as soldiers realized that even successful local engagements did not translate into strategic progress. Yet discipline largely held, and Polish commanders continued to issue orders for counterattacks in an effort to sustain momentum and morale. The humanitarian consequences for civilians worsened dramatically during this phase. Tomaszów Lubelski itself became a battlefield, with artillery fire destroying homes, shops, and public buildings. Krasnobrod and nearby villages were shelled repeatedly as control shifted between advancing and retreating units. Thousands of civilians fled southward, joining columns of refugees already displaced from earlier fighting. Roads became clogged with carts, livestock, and fleeing families, complicating military movements. Civilians caught in crossfire suffered casualties, while many others faced hunger and exposure as fields and food stores were requisitioned or destroyed. Political tensions further complicated the crisis. By this time, news of the Soviet invasion on September 17th had spread more widely among Polish commanders. Some officers realized that even if they broke through to Lwów, Soviet forces advancing from the east could block further resistance. Nevertheless, orders remained focused on reaching Lwów or the Romanian frontier, as surrender was not yet considered an option. This created a paradox. Soldiers fought desperately for objectives that were already compromised by developments beyond their immediate battlefield. German reports during this escalation phase acknowledged both the strength and determination of Polish resistance. Tank versus tank engagements were noted as particularly costly, with German Panzer I and II units suffering against Polish 7 TPs. Yet the broader picture favored the Germans. Their superiority in logistics ensured steady resupply of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, while Polish forces grew weaker by the hour. Commanders of the 2nd Panzer Division and 4th Light Division emphasized attrition, launching repeated counterattacks to wear down Polish strength, while infantry sealed off escape routes. On September 22nd to 23rd, the crisis reached its height. Polish units attempted one final series of thrusts southward, committing their last reserves of armor and artillery. Fierce clashes erupted near Tomaszów Lubelski, Narol, and Krasnobrod. Polish infantry fought with determination, at times recapturing villages and inflicting losses on German units. But the momentum could not be sustained. German armor and artillery pushed back, while Luftwaffe bombers struck Polish columns attempting to regroup. By the end of 23rd September, Polish formations were fragmented, their offensive potential effectively exhausted. The escalation and crisis phase thus revealed the imbalance that defined the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski. The Poles fought with courage and tactical skill, often winning local clashes, but lacked the resources to transform these into strategic breakthroughs. The Germans, though suffering heavier losses than anticipated, steadily tightened their control through superior logistics and reinforcement. Civilians bore immense suffering as their towns and villages became battlefields. By the close of 23rd September, the crisis had clarified the trajectory of the battle. Poland's forces could no longer sustain their offensive aims, while Germany was poised to deliver the decisive blows that would bring the campaign to its peak. The peak of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski occurred between the 24th and 27th of September 1939, when the largest and most intense clashes of the campaign were fought. At this stage, both the Northern Front under General Stefan Dąb, Biernacki, and the Southern Front under General Tadeusz Piskor were fully engaged, committing their last reserves in desperate attempts to break through German encirclement. The Germans, with the 2nd Panzer Division, the 4th Light Division, and several infantry divisions, pressed forward systematically, determined to finish the destruction of what remained of organized Polish resistance in southeastern Poland. On 24th September, the Poles launched one of their last major offensives toward Tomaszów Lubelski. Infantry, supported by the remaining 7 TP tanks and armored cars, attempted to pierce German defenses along the main road leading south. The attack initially achieved some gains, surprising German infantry units and retaking several villages. In one clash, Polish tanks destroyed a number of Panzer I and II vehicles at close range, demonstrating that their 37mm guns remained effective when ammunition was available. Yet the German response was swift. Counterattacks supported by Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, and concentrated artillery fire blunted the assault. Luftwaffe sorties further disrupted Polish movements, striking columns massed on narrow roads and destroying supply wagons. The following day, September 25th, the battle reached its highest intensity. German commanders, determined to exploit the exhaustion of Polish forces, ordered coordinated attacks along several sectors. Infantry divisions pressed from the north and west, while panzer units struck at exposed flanks. The result was a series of brutal engagements fought in villages, fields, and wooded terrain. Near Krasnobrod, Polish cavalry brigades launched dismounted counterattacks, temporarily halting German advances and capturing prisoners. However, these successes could not be sustained without artillery and armored support. By nightfall, Polish casualties had mounted significantly, while ammunition stocks were almost entirely depleted. For civilians, the peak days were catastrophic. Tomaszów Lubelski and surrounding settlements endured continuous artillery bombardment. Fires destroyed homes, churches, and schools, while streams of refugees filled the countryside. Improvised field hospitals, often set up in barns or basements, were overwhelmed by wounded soldiers and civilians alike. German requisitioning further drained local supplies of food and livestock. Many villagers fled into forests, where they faced hunger and exposure as fighting raged around them. The Polish command structure also came under extreme strain. General Dąb Biernaki's northern front was fragmented, its divisions scattered and often fighting without direct communication with headquarters. General Piskor, leading the southern front, faced similar problems. Units that had once numbered tens of thousands were reduced to small, exhausted groups with limited firepower. Tank units, already decimated, were down to a handful of operational vehicles. Artillery batteries had exhausted their shells and were either withdrawn or captured. Infantry divisions, still numerous in manpower, could fight defensively but lacked the means to sustain offensive operations. German forces, though superior, were not without difficulties. Reports from the 2nd Panzer Division acknowledged significant losses in men and vehicles, particularly during engagements with Polish 7 TP tanks and well-prepared ambushes. The 4th Light Division also suffered as it held extended lines against determined Polish infantry. Yet the ability of the Germans to bring in reinforcements, resupply fuel and ammunition, and coordinate with the Luftwaffe ensured that these difficulties never escalated into crisis. German operational doctrine, combining armor, motorized infantry, artillery, and air reconnaissance, proved decisive in wearing down the Poles. By 26th to 27th September, the peak had passed into collapse. Polish attempts to break through to Lwów were abandoned as ammunition was gone and soldiers were exhausted. Skirmishes continued, but they no longer held the character of organized offensives. German units pressed forward, capturing thousands of prisoners and seizing abandoned equipment. In many villages, Polish soldiers who could not escape surrendered in groups, often after prolonged firefights. The last armored vehicles were either destroyed in combat or abandoned for lack of fuel. The peak of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski demonstrated both the determination of Polish forces to resist and the overwhelming material advantage of the German army. It marked the culmination of weeks of fighting, concentrated into the largest armored clash of the campaign. For civilians, it was the moment of greatest suffering, as their towns and livelihoods were devastated by artillery, airstrikes, and the movement of massive armies. For both sides, the battle at its peak confirmed the trajectory of the September campaign. Polish forces, though still cohesive in spirit, were materially incapable of continuing the fight, while German forces were able to impose their will through coordination, mechanization, and sustained pressure. The stage was now set for the final phase of the battle, when resistance gave way to capitulation and the campaign entered its closing chapter. As the fighting at Tomaszów Lubelski moved beyond its peak, the Polish forces entered a phase defined by resistance and adaptation. From 27 September onward, both the Northern Front under General Stefan Dąb, Biernacki, and the Southern Front under General Tadeusz Piskor faced the reality that organized breakthroughs were no longer possible. Yet units did not dissolve into chaos. Instead, commanders sought ways to prolong resistance, delay German advances, and preserve their soldiers' cohesion under increasingly desperate conditions. Adaptation began with changes in tactics. With most of their tanks destroyed, immobilized, or abandoned for lack of fuel, Polish commanders shifted emphasis to infantry-based defenses. Villages, forests, and river crossings became fortified strongpoints, defended with rifles, machine guns, and what little artillery ammunition remained. Cavalry brigades, which had been central to earlier thrusts, now fought largely dismounted, using their mobility to move between defensive lines. These improvised tactics allowed Polish units to mount stubborn defenses even when deprived of heavy weapons. Resource management became the central challenge. Ammunition was nearly gone, forcing commanders to ration bullets to individual soldiers. Orders were given to fire only at close range, conserving the few remaining rounds. Artillery batteries, stripped of shells, were either hidden to avoid capture or destroyed by their crews. Food shortages became acute. Soldiers subsisted on potatoes, bread, and what could be requisitioned from local farms. Water supplies were gathered from streams, often under fire. In many units, horses served a dual role, pulling supply carts and, when necessary, being slaughtered for food. Despite these hardships, discipline largely held, a testament to the professionalism of officers and the determination of ordinary soldiers. Psychological adaptation was equally important. Soldiers were acutely aware that the wider strategic context had collapsed. News of the Soviet invasion had reached most units by this stage, confirming that even if Lwów were reached, escape to Romania was no longer realistic. Nevertheless, commanders emphasized the importance of maintaining honor, discipline, and organization, presenting resistance not as a path to victory, but as a duty to preserve the army's integrity. This message resonated with many soldiers, who continued to fight despite exhaustion and hunger. On the German side, adaptation meant shifting from high-intensity assaults to systematic reduction of Polish positions. Having recognized the tenacity of the defenders, German commanders relied more heavily on artillery and coordinated infantry advances rather than costly tank charges. The Luftwaffe conducted reconnaissance and occasional bombing runs, though bad weather reduced air activity in some areas. German infantry, supported by motorized units, moved methodically to occupy villages and force Polish surrenders. Reports noted growing numbers of prisoners taken each day, reflecting the gradual breakdown of Polish resistance. Civilians, too, adapted to the continuing presence of battle. Many who had not fled earlier now sought shelter in forests or moved southward with retreating Polish columns. Families scavenged food from abandoned fields, while barns and homes were converted into field hospitals. Some civilians provided intelligence to Polish units, guiding them along hidden forest paths. Others attempted neutrality, fearing German reprisals. The devastation of villages during this stage was severe, as both sides used civilian structures for defense or destroyed them in fighting. Despite these hardships, Polish units continued to mount localized counterattacks. Near Cieszanów and Narol, groups of infantry and cavalry attempted to disrupt German supply routes, briefly delaying mechanized columns. These actions, though tactically limited, demonstrated the resilience of Polish forces even as their strategic situation worsened. German reports acknowledged that Polish soldiers, though encircled and undersupplied, fought with determination and skill, requiring continued pressure to dislodge. By 28th to 29th September, adaptation had reached its limits. Polish forces were fragmented into smaller groups, each defending isolated sectors. Coordination between the northern and southern fronts broke down, as communication lines were cut, and commanders could not synchronize movements. German encirclement was nearly complete, leaving Polish units with no path to Lwów or the Romanian frontier. Nevertheless, resistance continued at local levels, with villages and forests still contested. This phase of resistance and adaptation highlighted both the resilience of Polish soldiers and the overwhelming advantage of German mechanization and logistics. The Polish army demonstrated an ability to adjust tactics, conserve resources, and maintain discipline under impossible conditions. Yet the imbalance of supplies, armor, and mobility ensured that no amount of improvisation could change the strategic outcome. By the end of September, the confrontation was shifting inexorably towards surrender, as the last organized formations faced the prospect of annihilation or capitulation. The turning point of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski came between 28th and 30th of September 1939, when the capacity of Polish forces to resist was finally exhausted, and the prospect of organized continuation of the fight disappeared. Up to this moment, both the Northern Front under General Stefan Dąb-Biernacki and the Southern Front under General Tadeusz Piskor had shown remarkable resilience, adapting to shortages and maintaining cohesion despite encirclement. But by the final days of September, the imbalance of strength, logistics, and strategic situation, especially the Soviet advance from the east, made further resistance untenable. On 28 September, German forces tightened the encirclement around Tomaszów Lubelski and surrounding areas. The 2nd Panzer Division, reinforced by infantry, pressed against Polish positions from the west, while the 4th Light Division advanced from the north. Infantry divisions moved in to secure villages and seal gaps, ensuring that no corridor remained open for a breakout. Polish units fought stubborn rearguard actions in forests and along river lines, but ammunition stocks were critically low. Some companies reported having only a handful of rounds per rifle, while artillery units were completely silent, their shells expended in earlier engagements. The Luftwaffe, though less active due to weather, provided reconnaissance to confirm Polish troop concentrations and guide German movements. The breaking point was reached on September 29th, when General Piskor, recognizing the hopelessness of the situation, began negotiations for surrender. His southern front, composed of the remnants of the Krakow and Lublin armies, had been reduced to exhausted infantry, scattered cavalry, and immobilized armor. Soldiers were hungry, fatigued, and largely out of ammunition. Attempts to regroup had failed, as German divisions cut every possible line of retreat. Piskor ordered his staff to preserve discipline and prepare for capitulation, emphasizing the need to prevent unnecessary loss of life. Meanwhile, General Dąb-Biernacki's northern front remained in the field a little longer, but was also collapsing under pressure. Units were dispersed, communication had broken down, and coordination between divisions was no longer possible. On October 30, Dąb-Biernacki's remaining forces attempted a final breakout in small groups, but these were quickly repelled or captured by German forces. By the end of the day, organized resistance in the Tomaszów sector had ceased, and thousands of Polish soldiers laid down their arms. For civilians, the turning point was marked by the arrival of German occupation authorities in the wake of combat operations. Villages devastated by artillery and tank battles now faced requisitions, curfews, and the presence of occupation troops. Refugees who had fled earlier tried to return to their homes, only to find them destroyed or confiscated. Improvised hospitals overflowed with wounded Polish soldiers, many of whom were taken prisoner once the surrender was formalized. Civilians who had supported Polish troops, whether by guiding them through forests or sharing food, faced suspicion and reprisals from German units determined to establish control. For the German army, the turning point confirmed the success of its encirclement strategy. Reports from the 14th Army emphasized that the elimination of over 100,000 Polish troops near Tomaszów Lubelski represented one of the final major victories of the September campaign. Commanders acknowledged that the battle had been costly, particularly in tank losses inflicted by Polish 7TPs and determined infantry, but the broader objective, preventing any Polish breakout to Lwów or Romania, had been achieved. The Polish perspective on the turning point reflected both realism and resignation. Officers noted that their troops had fought effectively despite overwhelming odds, but without ammunition, fuel, or supplies, further combat was impossible. The knowledge of the Soviet advance deepened the sense of inevitability. Even if German lines had been broken, escape routes to the southeast were blocked by Soviet troops. Under these conditions, surrender became the only option to preserve the lives of the soldiers still in the field. Thus, the turning point of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski was not a single dramatic clash, but the cumulative effect of attrition, encirclement, and geopolitical reality. By the end of September 1939, the largest armored confrontation of the Polish campaign had ended in German victory and Polish capitulation. For the soldiers who surrendered, the turning point meant the transition from active combat to captivity. For civilians, it meant the transition from battlefront to occupation. The final days of resistance had shown the determination of Polish forces, but they also underlined the impossibility of continuing the campaign once both German and Soviet armies had secured control of the country. The aftermath of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski unfolded rapidly at the turn of September into October 1939, as the last large concentrations of the Polish army laid down their arms. Following General Tadeusz Piskor's decision to capitulate on September 29th, the Southern Front ceased organized resistance. General Stefan Dąb-Biernaki's Northern Front attempted to hold out slightly longer, but by September 30th, his scattered units were either overwhelmed, forced to surrender, or disbanded into small groups trying to evade capture. In total, more than 150,000 Polish soldiers were taken prisoner in the Tomaszów region, making it one of the largest mass capitulations of the September campaign. The surrender was carried out with remarkable discipline. Reports from German units described Polish formations assembling in orderly ranks to hand over weapons, with officers formally presenting their swords. This contrasted with earlier routes seen elsewhere, where disorganized remnants fled or were captured piecemeal. The structured nature of the capitulation reflected the professionalism of the Polish command, even in defeat. For German commanders, the scene offered confirmation that the last organized resistance in southeastern Poland had been extinguished. For the soldiers themselves, the aftermath meant captivity. Enlisted men were marched to makeshift assembly points before being transported to prisoner of war camps in Germany. Officers were separated and sent to Oflags, while enlisted personnel were placed in stalags. Conditions in transit were harsh. Overcrowded columns, minimal rations, and long marches through devastated terrain. Many soldiers, weakened by hunger and exhaustion from weeks of campaigning, collapsed along the way. A smaller number evaded capture, slipping into forests or hiding with sympathetic civilians, and later joined underground resistance or attempted to reach Hungary and Romania. Civilians in Tomaszów Lubelski and surrounding villages faced immediate consequences. With the end of combat, German occupation authorities imposed requisition orders, seizing food, livestock, and property to feed their forces. Homes damaged during the battle were often confiscated or destroyed, leaving families displaced. Refugees who had crowded the region during the fighting now faced a humanitarian crisis. Scarce food, ruined infrastructure, and the looming presence of occupation. Improvised field hospitals, overwhelmed during the battle, were cleared of wounded Polish soldiers as German forces took control. Many civilians who had aided Polish troops feared reprisals, while others sought to adapt quickly to the new administration in order to survive. The humanitarian toll was considerable. Thousands of Polish soldiers had been killed or wounded during the fighting, and German losses, though lower, were still significant given the intensity of the armored clashes. Villages across the region bore scars of artillery bombardment, with craters in fields, burned houses, and destroyed churches. Local economies collapsed as agricultural cycles were disrupted, livestock lost, and transport routes damaged. For civilians, the aftermath of the battle meant not only the physical destruction of their communities, but also the beginning of a prolonged period of occupation. Politically, the capitulation at Tomaszów Lubelski confirmed the collapse of the Polish state's ability to wage organized war. With Warsaw fallen, the government in exile established abroad, and both German and Soviet armies controlling Polish territory, the September campaign had effectively ended. The battle represented the last significant engagement involving regular, large-scale Polish forces. After Tomaszów, resistance would shift to other forms: underground networks, local partisan activity, and the reconstitution of Polish units abroad in France and later Britain. For the German army, the battle's aftermath reinforced the success of Blitzkrieg doctrine. The encirclement and destruction of large enemy forces using coordinated armor, infantry, and air power was precisely the operational model tested in Poland. Reports highlighted the effectiveness of mechanized units in sealing off Polish armies and the importance of maintaining logistical superiority. However, German records also noted the unexpectedly heavy resistance and the tactical effectiveness of Polish 7TP tanks, lessons that influenced German armored doctrine in subsequent campaigns. By early October, the Tomaszów Lubelski region was firmly under German control. Prisoner transports moved westward, while occupation authorities consolidated their administration. For the population of southeastern Poland, the aftermath of the battle marked the transition from frontline warfare to the daily reality of occupation, restrictions, and survival under foreign control. For the Polish army, it marked the end of organized campaigns on national soil in 1939, closing the chapter of the September, fighting with one of the largest and most consequential surrenders of the campaign. The legacy of the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski occupies a complex place in the history of the September Campaign of 1939. Unlike the sieges of Warsaw, Modlin, or Hell, which have entered wider public memory, Tomaszów Lubelski has often been overshadowed, despite being one of the largest armored clashes of the campaign. Its significance lies not only in the scale of forces involved, more than 150,000 Polish soldiers against multiple German divisions, but also in what it revealed about modern warfare, strategic realities, and the fate of the Polish state at the outbreak of the Second World War. Militarily, the battle demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the Polish army. The use of the 7TP light tank, superior in many respects to German Panzer Is and IIs, showed that Polish industry had produced equipment capable of meeting contemporary standards. In direct engagements, these tanks inflicted notable losses on German armor. Yet the broader imbalance, insufficient numbers, fuel shortages, inadequate anti-air support, and fragmented command structures negated these advantages. For German forces, the battle confirmed the effectiveness of blitzkrieg tactics, where coordination of armor, infantry, and air power could encircle and neutralize numerically significant opponents. Tomaszów Lubelski thus became an operational lesson, reinforcing confidence in doctrines that would be applied on a larger scale in France in 1940. Strategically, the battle underlined the impossibility of Poland continuing the campaign once the Soviet Union entered from the east. Even had Pskov or Dąb-Biernacki broken through German lines, their path toward Romania was blocked by advancing Soviet forces. This dual invasion shaped the legacy of the battle. Polish forces fought with discipline and determination, but geopolitics rendered their efforts unsustainable. In later historical debates, Tomaszów has been cited as an example of Poland's impossible position, squeezed between two major powers whose coordination sealed the country's fate. For civilians, the legacy was immediate and long-lasting. The destruction of villages, confiscation of property, and imposition of occupation marked the beginning of years of hardship under German rule. Many of those displaced during the fighting never returned to their homes, and the scars of combat, ruined farms, mass graves, and damaged infrastructure remained visible for decades. The memory of the battle was preserved locally in oral histories, emphasizing both the suffering of non-combatants and the resilience shown in surviving the devastation. For the Polish military tradition, Tomaszów Lubelski was remembered as the final major stand of organized field armies in 1939. After this, resistance shifted to irregular forms, underground networks, partisan warfare, and the reconstitution of Polish forces abroad. Veterans who survived captivity carried the memory of the battle into exile, where they contributed to new formations in France, Britain, and later the Middle East. Within Poland itself, commemoration was complicated by the political context. Under German occupation, open remembrance was impossible. After the war, in the People's Republic of Poland, narratives of September 1939 were shaped by official ideology, often emphasizing the Soviet role as liberators, while downplaying or reframing battles fought against Germany before Soviet entry. As a result, Tomaszów Lubelski received less recognition than it might have in other political conditions. In modern historical study, the battle has regained attention as a significant episode of armored warfare. Analysts have examined the operational choices of both Polish and German commanders, noting the discipline of Polish units despite encirclement and the efficiency of German mechanization. The confrontation has also been placed in the broader European context, illustrating how the September campaign became the testing ground for tactics later applied across the continent. Culturally, the legacy of Tomaszów Lubelski lies in its dual character, a forgotten clash in popular memory, yet a critical marker in military history. Monuments and memorials in the region commemorate the soldiers who fought there, while academic works highlight its significance as the second-largest battle of the campaign after Bzura. For Poland, it represents both the limits of national defense under overwhelming external pressure and the persistence of organized resistance until the very end of September 1939. In historical debates, Tomaszów Lubelski remains a case study in the relationship between tactical success and strategic failure. Polish units fought effectively on the battlefield, inflicting losses and holding positions under severe strain. Yet no amount of localized resistance could alter the broader reality of a two-front invasion. The battle's legacy, therefore, is not measured in territorial gains or losses, but in its place as the final concentrated effort of the Polish army before the collapse of the September campaign. Thus, the Battle of Tomaszów Lubelski stands as both a forgotten clash and a decisive moment, marking the close of Poland's regular military resistance in 1939. Its historical significance endures as a reminder of the challenges faced by a nation caught between two aggressors, the evolution of modern armored warfare, and the enduring impact of these events on both soldiers and civilians.